Hi, my name is Bjorn, and welcome to Twisted Faith. I post true crime stories on this channel on a monthly basis, so if you're interested in the world of crime and absurd criminal behavior, please subscribe to this channel and turn on bell notifications to make sure you don't miss any of our future videos.
911, what's your emergency?
Alison Botha was born on the 22nd of September 1967 in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. Alison was a normal girl growing up in the city of Port Elizabeth, where she lived with her father Brian, her mother Claire, and her brother Neil. Her parents divorced when she was about 10 years old, in which she and her brother Neil continued to live with their mother. Alison graduated high school in 1985 as head girl at the Collegiate High School for Girls in Port Elizabeth. After high school, she completed her secretarial degree at university and thereafter traveled overseas for 4 years before finally settling down in Port Elizabeth as an insurance broker. On December 18, 1994, 27-year-old Alison Botha had spent most of the day with her friends at the beach in her hometown of Port Arthur. As the sun was about to go down, Alison invited everyone back to her flat for something to eat and drink. At the end of the evening, her guests decided it was time to head home, and since it wasn't safe to walk the streets after dark, Alison had given rides to some of her friends who didn't have a means of transportation. When she eventually returned to her apartment around 3 a.m., Alison realized that someone had taken her usual parking space in front of the building, thus forcing her to settle for a spot that was further away down the street. As she was parking her car, someone stood close by, watching her. And as she was about to get out of her car, someone suddenly opened the driver's side door, and before she had time to react, a man put a knife to her throat and told her to move to the passenger seat and keep quiet or he would kill her immediately. Alison did as she was told and tried to remain calm in hopes that the man would release her unarmed if she cooperated with his demands. As they drove off into the darkness, he told her that his name was Clinton and that he simply wanted to borrow her car. He promised Alison that he would let her go only if she behaved and kept quiet. Having never been in the presence of true evil, Alison, with the good heart that she has, believed her kidnapper and kept quiet while the man continued driving into the darkness. When the man she knew as Clinton pulled onto the side street and came to a stop, it hadn't been to set Alison free, but rather to let an even more threatening presence into the car. She would later state that when she looked in the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of the figure in the back seat, she knew that she was in big trouble. Instead of the men keeping to their promise and letting her go, Alison's abductors had taken her to a remote spot on the outskirts of the city. Once there, they had thrown her on the ground amongst piles of dirt and broken glass. And it was there that Alison knew the worst was still to come. While lying hopelessly on the floor in the presence of true evil, Alison's kidnappers informed her that they are going to force themselves upon her, and the man who referred to himself as Clinton asked Alison if she planned on fighting back. Alison, still holding on to the notion that Clinton would keep his promise and let her go, she assured him that she would cooperate if it meant seeing her family again.
The men, seemingly satisfied with her response, the horror only escalated. Clinton proceeded to violently abuse Alison in every way imaginable.
When he was finished,
he had turned her over to his accomplice, who had frightened her from the moment she had laid eyes on him. As she braced herself for what was about to come, he had proceeded to viciously abuse Alison while simultaneously choking her. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, she had lost control of her bodily functions, causing her to evacuate her bowels. While Alison didn't realize this at the time, this natural reflex may very well have helped save her life. The men who had previously been arrested on rape charges decided in advance that the only way to avoid jail time would be to make sure that their future victims couldn't go to the police. With this in mind, once they had finished abusing her, they had taken turns stabbing Alison in the abdomen. By the time they were through, she had sustained 37 penetrating wounds to her body, causing her intestines to spill out onto the ground. As her killers stood over her, chatting and admiring their work, they were surprised to see that Alison was still breathing. In an attempt to finish the job, Clinton stood over Alison and sliced her throat 16 times with deadly precision. Despite her grave injuries, Alison had been aware of his hand moving back and forth in front of her face as he slashed her so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. Once they were certain that she was well and truly dead, the men had dropped their act and called each other by their proper names as they climbed into Alison's car and prepared to head back to the city. As the headlights disappeared into the night, the ravaged young woman miraculously regained consciousness. As she laid broken and clinging onto life in the middle of nowhere, with her abdomen wide open, Alison wrote a farewell note in the sand. After letting her mother know one last time that she loved her, she scrawled the names of her kidnappers into the ground so that whoever found her body would know the first names of the men who were responsible for her death. Though it probably would have been easier for her to lay down and accept the inevitable, Alison hadn't been ready to give up on life just yet. Aware that she had to get help fast, the choice to live would become her only option as she had pulled herself up and started walking towards the road. As she took the first step, she noticed that her line of vision was impaired to such an extent that she couldn't see what was ahead of her. It was only when she put her hands to her face that she realized that her neck had been almost completely cut through, making it impossible for her to hold her head upright. Just as she was coming to terms with the severity of her injuries, she felt something wet around her ankles. Holding her head in place so that she could look down, she saw that her intestines were hanging down her legs. Utterly in a state of shock and pure survival, Alison was determined to make it to safety or die trying. Alison, who was completely naked and covered in blood, had to figure out a way to put her body back together before continuing. After discovering that her kidnappers had left her clothes behind, she had used her shirt to fashion a sling with which to carry her intestines. As she held her intestines in one hand, she used the other hand to hold her head in place while she resumed her walk to find potential help. The walk to the nearest road almost seemed impossible. Even so, whether by sheer force or will, she managed to make it to the highway. She would later say that she felt as if she had been carried by a force she could neither see nor explain. Since it was the middle of the night, traffic was all but non-existent. Still, Alison held out hope that an angel would find her in the darkness and lead her to the light. Against all odds, she got her wish. No longer able to carry on, Alison had collapsed in the roadway. As she laid on the pavement, her life slipping away, she saw headlights approaching in the distance. When the car reached her, the driver had slowed down long enough to take a look before speeding off without offering assistance. Moments later, she heard another vehicle coming towards her. This time, rather than passing by her, it happened to stop. In a stroke of luck,
A 20-year-old veterinary student from Johannesburg named Tian Illert
had been taking the scenic route with a friend that put them in the right place at the right time. While his friend called for an ambulance on his mobile phone, Tian had knelt down and gently maneuvered Alison's protruding trachea back in place. He had then covered her with his shirt before taking hold of her hand and reassuring her that help was on the way. For whatever reason, it had taken the ambulance nearly 45 minutes to make the 15-minute drive. When they finally did arrive on the scene, the reactions of the stunned paramedics suggest that they put the victim's chances of survival at 0. When the ambulance dropped Alison off at the hospital after a ride that had taken much longer than it should have, emergency room doctors got to work straight away on the young woman who had sustained more injuries than her body could normally withstand. Even so, believing that where there was life, there was hope, they had put everything they had into bringing their patient, who had shown a remarkable will to live, back from the brink of death. Miraculously, none of the 50-odd stab wounds had hit any artery or vital organ. What's even more impressive, since Alison's intestines had been emptied due to the strangulation, her abdominal cavity hadn't turned septic. Even though they were covered in dirt, her gaping wounds had shown no signs of infection. As a result of the horrific injuries to her throat, a tube had been inserted into Alison's windpipe to aid in her breathing. When detectives brought a book filled with photos of potential suspects to the hospital only hours after the attack, she had picked out the men that have changed her life forever. One of the suspects, Franz the Toy, the man who referred to himself as Clinton, who initially abducted Alison at her apartment, was a 26-year-old husband and father with a criminal history that included violent attacks on women. While he had been accused of rape on multiple occasions, he had gotten off time and time again with a slap on the wrist, which may have had something to do with the fact that his father was a police officer. Besides his reputation as a sex offender, Franz had also displayed a passion for arson, having set fire to a schoolhouse as a teenager, a fringe dweller who had a hard time abiding to the rules of society. After getting romantically involved with a self-proclaimed dark witch, he had allegedly declared himself a disciple of Satan. The other half of this cowardly duo was even more of a wild card than his partner. 19-year-old Theuns Krieger was trouble walking on 2 legs. As opposed to his troubled upbringing, Thiers had grown up living hand to mouth in an allegedly abusive household. His father, rather than being in law enforcement, was a career criminal who had been in and out of prison throughout much of his son's childhood. Proving that birds of a feather flock together, he too had dabbed in Satanism. While Franz may have fancied himself a ladies' man, Theuns had no such delusions. With neither looks nor intellect to his credit, he was someone whom most women found repulsive. Stung by the constant rejection, he had grown to hate the opposite sex almost as much as he wanted them sexually. When Franz was interrogated by police regarding what happened to Alison, he had assumed that he was being questioned about a murder. When he was informed that his victim had yet survived, Franz knew the game was over. Realizing that authorities had him cornered, Franz had handed over a ring caked in blood that was identified as belonging to Alison Botha. So if there might have been any lingering doubts as to his involvement, all such thoughts were erased in that moment. When Alison was able to speak, she was asked to pick her attackers out of a lineup. Her case would be the first in the history of the South African legal system in which a one-way mirror was used to protect the victim from having come face to face with their alleged assailants. Even though Franz and Theuns had altered their appearances in an attempt to skirt justice, Alison had easily pointed out Franz and Theuns. In spite of their efforts to show her off, their faces had been burned into her memory forever. The pair, who were subsequently dubbed the Ripper Rapists by the media, were charged with kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder. Not long after being taken into custody, Franz announced that he was possessed by a demon and in need of an exorcism. Surprisingly, his jailers arranged a man to perform the ritual. Whether it worked or not, it is unknown. In the end, it didn't matter. Neither the public nor the court system had sympathy for this particular evil. The trial began on June 12, 1995. During the proceedings, 2 prior victims had taken the stand to recount their ordeals at the hands of the accused. Both testified that they had been warned by their attackers not to go to police,
though they had sworn to keep their assaults to themselves.
The woman, one of whom had been visibly pregnant at the time of the assault, had gone straight to authorities upon their release. Franz and Tiens were quickly arrested, but were back on the streets before the ink on their warrants were dry. A third woman, who had narrowly escaped their clutches, testified that she had been driving around looking for a parking space at around 12:30 p.m. on December 16, 1994, 2 days before Alison was abducted, when she noticed 2 scary-looking characters watching her. As she pulled into an open space, she observed the men moving rapidly towards a car. Her survival instincts kicking in, she had stayed put and locked the doors. When they realized that she wasn't getting out and they weren't getting in, the pair had fled. Later on, she recognized their faces from the news reports of Alison's brutal assault and attempted murder. On August 7, 1995, the court rendered its verdict: guilty on all charges. The presiding judge sentenced both Franz and Tiens to life in prison. Following Alison's recovery, that her own doctors described as nothing short of miraculous, Alison was released from the hospital after 3 weeks. With a long road ahead of her, she continued her rehabilitation on an outpatient basis. With Franz and Tiens behind bars where they belonged, Alison began the long process of taking back her life. Though she had been understandably mired in depression for quite some time, she pulled herself out of the pit of despair when she realized that she had a story that needed to be told. Rather than letting her attackers take more from her than they already had, she opted to use what she learned from her experience to help others, which in turn did wonders for her own emotional healing. Her life back on track at last, Alison married and became a mother of 2 sons. This was yet another victory for the woman whose assailants had admitted that they had deliberately tried
to destroy her female reproductive organs.
Once again, Alison's strength and determination had won out over the unspeakable acts of cruelty. In 2016, a book called Eye of Life, Alison's Journey as told by Marianne Tam, was published. Later that same year, a documentary about her near-fatal events and their aftermath was produced. The film, aptly titled Alison, was loaded by audiences and critics alike, admiring her mind-blowing survival story. When Franz got wind that the film was being made about the case, he had offered to be interviewed, but only if Alison would submit a handwritten letter of forgiveness in advance. What's more, he also asked for a share of the proceeds from the documentary and the book, as well as a cut of the earnings Alison received from her speaking engagements. By his sinister way of thinking, she wouldn't have had these opportunities if it was not for him, so he should be entitled to a share in the spoils. Unwilling to be pawns in his twisted game, Alison and her team refused to entertain his ridiculous demands. As the story has gripped the South African nation for years to come and fuels the debate of the ongoing gender-based violence happening in the country of South Africa, this story showcases that the will to live is one of the most powerful aspects of the human body. In the end, we all want to have a perfect ending, but life in short is not always as straightforward as our favorite Hollywood films. Just recently, the man who tried to kill Alison has served 28 years after the Port Elizabeth High Court sentenced them to life imprisonment. The Department of Correctional Services said their parole was considered in the line with the Correctional Services Act. And as of today, Frans de Toit and Teens Krieger have been admitted into the system of community corrections, whereby they are expected to comply with a specific set of parole conditions and will be subjected to supervision for the rest of their natural lives, meaning that these men are yet again walking the streets of South Africa. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like and a comment on the video, and do not forget to subscribe and turn on bell notifications to make sure you do not miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Bjorn, and I post true crime stories. Welcome to Twisted Faith, and I'll see you in the next one.